Long Voyage Back, page 263. This is the third episode from the end. After this one, 2 more to go. Once again, Vagabond sailed on alone. The 2 boats were parted. Tony, Oscar and the 4 others had taken Scorpio, planning to sail it downwind back to Barbados. Neil had checked over the relative food supplies of the 2 ships, sent some back to Scorpio and had given Tony one of the 2 automatic rifles and some ammunition. His last exchange with Tony was brief. "Good luck," Neil said to him as they prepared to cast off the rafting lines. Tony, who had been unusually subdued in the 2 hours since Frank had been shot, simply nodded. "You too," he said, and as Neil released one line and was moving to untie the next, added quickly, "Sorry about," but didn't finish. Neil merely released the second line, signalled Ollie onto the port bow to release his, and the 2 boats, free of each other at last, angled out and away from each other. Since Vagabond was now altering course from west back to southeast, the 2 boats had to cross paths once more, Vagabond luffing her sails and then sailing across Scorpio's wake. For a moment, everyone on both boats acted as if the other boat weren't there. Only Ollie, still on Vagabond's bow collecting the fenders, stood up and waved heartily. "Go get 'em, Tony!" he shouted. Tony gave a subdued wave in return, and then the 2 vessels were speeding away from each other, one to the west and one to the southeast, each to its own fate. "Always give people encouragement when they're sailing off," Ollie said to Neil after he returned aft. "Otherwise they might come back." Philip and Sheila had remained with Vagabond. When Sheila had talked to her husband late that morning about joining Scorpio, Philip had shaken his head. "I have to have something to live for," Philip told her. "With those people I wouldn't. Here, I do." But his fever was now 103 degrees. Neil started a 3rd antibiotic. Frank, berthed in the dinette where Philip had been, was still alive. They had sedated him, drained the blood from the lung, and managed with great difficulty and uncertainty to draw almost a pint of blood from Sheila's arm and inject it into Frank. Neil knew that with the primitive syringe he was using there was a danger of embolism, but he had concluded that without a transfusion Frank wouldn't survive the first night. Lisa and Jim were quarantined in Frank's old cabin, Philip installed on the wheelhouse settee with Sheila in the forepeak. Jean and Skippy remained in the port cabin, but Jean began to spend most of her time with Lisa and Jim, planning to sleep on their cabin floor. The disease would reach its climax in the first 3 or 4 days, so the battle might well be won or lost quickly. Knowing that the disease was not airborne and that cleanliness could have a decisive effect on whether it spread or not, Neil hoped that they could contain it. He was less hopeful that they could save Jim and Lisa. It wouldn't be for lack of trying. All during the long first day, Jean and Neil tended the 2 feverish patients. They lay on adjacent berths, only conscious occasionally, sometimes hallucinating. Their temperatures over 105 degrees. Jean worked tirelessly, putting on and taking off the seaweed-soaked towels and shirts, carrying Lisa's bony, torrid body to immerse her in the side cockpit, which had been filled with 6 inches of seaweed. She watched helplessly as the fever raged on unabated, and Lisa's breath became faster and faster, shallower and shallower. Neil helped bring water and towels and move Jim when necessary. Sheila often helped them, but most of the burden was Jean's. Neil found it depressing to be down in the heat and stink of Frank's cabin to confront the sweating bodies, feverish eyes, and incoherent mumblings of Jim and Lisa. Jim kept trying to act as if he were only mildly sick and joking about it, always asking about Lisa, who was just out of sight around the partition that separated their 2 berths, and once even volunteering to help carry her to the water sea bath in the cockpit. When he found he couldn't even stand up, he lost some of his useful cockiness. With 3 of the ship's company close to death, and those who were still healthy feeling almost powerless to help them, the gloom during the day was broken only once, when in the late afternoon Ollie unexpectedly announced that they should hold a short memorial service for Conrad Macklin, as they had 10 days before for Katya. "He was our shipmate," Ollie explained, "and besides, burying him might put us in a better mood." So Ollie, Neil and Sheila had stood awkwardly in a side cockpit and Ollie had spoken. "Well, Lord, we want to pay our last respects to Conrad Macklin," Ollie began in a serious voice and with a bowed head. "Connie was probably beat on as a kid, and his mom probably weaned him too early, and his dad must have kicked his butt, so he developed into something of a shit, Lord. Pardon the expression, but he didn't work hard at it, and was only that way when he felt like it. Still, we figure you got the big picture, Lord, and we'll know exactly what to do with Connie. Us, we got the small picture. All we could think of doing with him was throwing him to the sharks. Amen, Lord. Over and out." Neil and Sheila said nothing. "Now we symbolically commit his body to the sea," said Ollie, and when he slapped Neil on the back, Neil gathered the ceremony was over. "Funny thing, Death," Ollie announced as they walked back into the wheelhouse. Neil waited for him to come out with some sort of punchline, but he didn't, as if his 3 words summarised his meagre fund of wisdom on the subject. Neil was doctoring Frank. When the wounded man spoke without bitterness of Tony and Macklin, his tranquillity began to remind Neil of Sam Broomberger. Frank even joked about their triangular relationship with Jean, announcing that he was retiring from the field. Feeling helpless in treating Frank 12 hours after the mutiny, Neil made the decision to head for land. Frank's chances were slim at best, and then only if they could find modern medical facilities on the coast of Brazil. Neil was aware of the dangers involved. The Brazilian government was sinking unauthorised ships who tried to land. The day before, an airplane had passed overhead, the first they had seen since leaving the Virgin Islands, and a freighter had passed them heading south. These sights had disturbed Neil at the time. He feared that the Vagabond's presence might be reported to the Brazilian military authorities. His hope lay in their lying off the northeastern coast of Brazil, relatively uninhabited, and in Vagabond approaching the coast at night and hopefully arriving at dawn. He consulted with each of the others, warned them of the terrible dangers of landing, but they all voted to risk it. Frank alone argued against it. "I don't think I'm going to make it no matter how many tubes they stick in me," he said painfully. "You ought to stay out to sea." But they turned southwest, heading for one of the coastal towns to the north of the mouth of the Amazon. Neil didn't plan to sail into a harbour, but to sneak in, find a sympathetic doctor, and only then to bring Frank ashore. At dusk, after looking at his primitive large-scale map of the coast, he went off to fetch their automatic rifle and began planning defensive strategies for their landfall. The rifle was missing. He asked Sheila if she had moved it. She said no, nor had Ollie. Disturbed, he discovered the 9mm automatic on his cabin shelf was missing too. He asked Ollie to check for the 2 other weapons they kept in the main cabin, and he reported them missing too. He and Ollie were leaving the main cabin feeling baffled when Jean met them coming from hers. "I threw the guns overboard," she announced quietly, looking frightened at what Neil's reaction might be. Neil stopped in front of her, stunned, staring at her, not wanting to believe her, but knowing that this was the only explanation. "All 4 of them?" he asked. She nodded. "My God," he commented, turning away from her and staring off stern. "I know I seem crazy to you," she said quietly, "but I don't want to live in the kind of world they create." Neil still looked away, his lined, bearded face tense and puzzled. "I love you, Neil. I know you've saved us a dozen times, sometimes with guns, but never again. Now we live or die like the rest of God's creatures by the strength of our bodies alone." Neil stared stiffly out to sea, Ollie behind him stroking his wispy white beard and scowling. "I can understand what you did, Jane," Sheila said from the helm. "The guns make us part of the madness of the rest of the world. I'm glad they're gone." Jean looked thankfully at Sheila, then back at Neil. "Never trusted him myself either," said Ollie. "Only thing I ever killed with a gun was a rabbit, and he died of a heart attack from me missing him so often." Neil walked further aft and stared out at the Vagabond's wake. At first he had felt enraged that Jean had acted behind his back like that, frightened by the unexpected loss of weapons he thought he needed to survive. But with the voices of Sheila and Ollie echoing Jean's, he felt an unexpected sense of tranquillity replacing his anger. The guns were gone. They themselves were out at sea, only half a day from landing the enemy. It was not possible that the kind of fighting they had to do was over. But even if it wasn't, the odds were heavily against their winning, even with guns. They'd have to fight the way they'd fought the submarine. We'd better, he thought, smiling ruefully to himself at the thought of their being armed now only with Ollie's gaff and the flare gun. He walked back to Jean and held her gently. "You did what you had to, Jean," he said, aware of the tension in her that these new horrors had caused. He could feel her yielding only slightly to his embrace. "We haven't had much luck holding off death with guns, so it can't be much worse without." At dawn they were still 20 miles off the coast. An hour later land came within sight. 10 minutes after that a jet fighter bomber, a French Mirage, streaked out the sky from the west and passed with a roar directly over them. Neil had made contingency plans for both air and sea attacks and, being unarmed, their plans involved either surrendering or playing possum. They were already flying the Brazilian flag, homemade from a piece of sheet, but it would be difficult to surrender to a jet plane they had no radio contact with. As the jet shrieked past and began to climb, he turned and shouted to everyone to get down into Frank's cabin. He himself dashed below to prepare the flares. He didn't know whether the jet would return or whether it would attack them if it did, but as Ollie and Sheila passed him carrying Philip, they exchanged pained glances, the look of soldiers marching to a battle they didn't expect to win. As he returned from the main cabin with the flares, Neil had a chance to look back. The jet was making a long, graceful sweep up the sky to the right of them, then around and back towards Vagabond. Neil was alone at the helm, making no effort to take evasive action. 2 smoke flares and 2 fire flares on the control panel shelf, a box of dry matches nearby. The plane grew rapidly larger, and Neil experienced the brief image of a man facing a firing squad. Then there was a brief flash from beneath the jet, and almost simultaneously the rush and roar of the missile tearing past the trimaran. The jet shrieked past a second time. His hands trembling, Neil lit one of the smoke flares and tossed it down into the main cabin. He lit the second one and threw it down into the empty port cabin. Dark smoke billowed up out of both cabins within seconds as Neil returned to prepare to ignite one of the light flares. The missile had struck at least half a mile ahead of Vagabond, but he doubted the pilot had been able to follow its trajectory. As the jet rose and swept to the right a second time, the pilot would look back and see his target enveloped in dark smoke. Their hope lay in the pilot being satisfied with a probable kill. But the jet returned. As Neil lit his third flare, it fired a second missile. So close did the second shot come to Vagabond that Neil thought it might have gone through the mainsail. It burst less than 100 yards in front of them. The bright flash of the lit flare must have looked to the pilot, if he could see it, which was doubtful, like a direct hit. The jet roared over the smoke-enshrouded trimaran, and Neil, coughing and almost overcome by smoke, rushed forward and dropped the jib and mainsail. He then rushed back through the smoke and down into the starboard cabin with the others. Thick black smoke was pouring out of 2 Vagabond's cabins into the air. Neil's hands were black, and one hand had been burned when he lit the third flare. Jean and the others looked at him, as if they were asking him to announce their fate. He didn't have to tell them they hadn't been hit, and only later did he realise they didn't even know they'd been fired on. The jet did not return a fourth time. It returned to base apparently confident that it prevailed in its battle with the trimaran. After 5 minutes of waiting, with the smoke gradually getting worse even in the closed-off cabin, Neil and Ollie went back up on the deck. Both smoke flares were going out, but something was still burning in the galley. Neil had to go down and extinguish a smouldering rug. The whole interior of the main cabin was black with smoke. The others now climbed out of Jean's cabin to survey the damage, but there was no damage. The multi-million-dollar aircraft had fired 2 highly sophisticated missiles at the plywood and fiberglass sailboat, but, as Neil explained, they had been metal or heat-seeking missiles. Vagabond, engineless, gave off no heat, and had so little metal and aluminium spars that the missile couldn't find her. The pilot had been trained to fire in the general area of the target and let the missile do the fine-tuning. Vagabond and her crew had been saved by modern technology. 2 hours later they raised sail again. After they had discussed the next course of action, they decided they should get as far out of the area as possible, to run directly east for another 60 miles, which would put them 50 or 60 miles off the coast. They would have to do their best for Frank and Philip and Lisa and Jim, without the help of the rest of the world. They were alone.